Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the very last Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk of 2023. Come on, they're not that bad. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and live online. Hi, online. So whether you're in Bristol or you're far away, you can join in the conversation. So my name is Martin O'Leary. I am the studio community lead here. I'm a white man in my 40s, long hair and a beard, wearing a brown woolly jumper on this very cold December afternoon. So every Friday, we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend some time in our space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. So a special big welcome to anyone who's new to the studio. Anyone new to the studio want to put their hand up? We got one. All right. This bit is for you. What is the Pervasive Media Studio? And for the online people, I'm sure there's some new online people. We're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology, everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. And we're a partnership between Watershed, where we are right now, the University of the West of England and the University of Bristol, and we're funded by Arts Council England. And what we do is we offer studio space with desks, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, all for free to our residents as part of a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. And we're a space for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and to make time for collaboration. So a few little useful facts before we start. Please feel free to move around, make a cup of tea, grab a coffee, glass of water in the kitchen just behind you there. If you need to take a break at any point, we have a quiet space just through this wall on my left, your right. If you need to take a break at any point, just pop in there. There are fire exits at either end of the studio. If you hear a fire alarm, there's no drills or anything planned, so that's probably real. The studio team will direct you, but again, it's at the other end of the studio, my left, your right. And there are accessible toilets and baby change in the corridor next to the kitchen. No babies today, but I will keep hammering that point. There's a Q&A at the end of the talk. Those of you who are watching online, you can pop your questions into the YouTube chat. Tony is here. He will be your voice in the room today. If you're in the building, you can raise your hand and we'll send a microphone around. You can get news on all of our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at PM Studio UK on Twitter, at Pervasive Media Studio at mastodon.social on Mastodon, or at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. So this is the last talk of the year, but talks will be... Thanks, Tony. This is the last talk of the year. Talks will be back on January 12th. The details for those will be on the website soon. So, our speaker for today is Adrienne Mackey. Adrienne is a multidisciplinary artist who teaches in the drama and digital arts departments in the University of Washington in the US, so she's come a very long way to see us today. She also runs the genre-bending arts company Swim Pony, which creates analog and transmedia performances, focusing on a variety of subjects ranging from environmentalism and mortality to labor rights. Today she's going to share some of her past immersive works and offer some insights into their genesis and creative process. So please do join me in giving a very warm welcome to Adrienne.
Thank you. Is that my?
That's your camera.
All right. Hello on the interwebs. I'm a blonde woman with a fabulous floral print dress on today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that I have done with Swim Pony. I'm the founder and artistic director of the company. As Martin mentioned, I'm also on the faculty at the University of Washington in the drama and digital arts departments. In the second half of today, I'm going to do a deeper dive on this most recent project that is currently in progress called Trail Off, which is a GPS translocative audio app aimed at increasing diversity of nature trail users. But before I do that, I'll give some background of some past works to give you a sense of the kind of stuff that we like to do. So Swim Pony's mission is to create joyful live performances that invite audiences into critical examination of the surrounding world. And the company's genre-defying work is created with a diverse ensemble of multidisciplinary artists who fuse site-based theater, immersive staging, and interactive game design. To give you a sense of some of the ways that that's manifested in the past, this was the company's first work. It was a piece called Survive. I was a chemistry major as an undergraduate, and I was really interested that you never got to see plays. If you saw a play about science, you saw a bunch of people in white coats talking about concepts, right? But the actual experience never gave you a visceral sense of the concepts. So this was my attempt to make a piece that made you feel the scale of the universe. So in it, audiences would come into this crazy interactive performance space and meet a 10th dimensional narrator. It was based on the US NASA Voyager, which sent this message into space, kind of saying, here's where Earth is. And so the thesis of the piece was, well, what if the universe sent a message back? What would it look like? So audiences would get a chance to walk around the different space. There were multiple places where they got a chance to choose their own adventure through this 20,000 square foot installation that we created. I think there were 128 different variations through the show. I think maybe I'm the only person who experienced all 128 of them. But a lot of the spaces that people would travel into would be things like this. So rather than watching a bunch of people talking about something, it would be a way to create a sort of embodied experiential sense of scale of the cosmos in relationship to humanity. In a very different vein, this is a piece called It's So Learning, which is a collaboration with my husband's theater company, which focuses on alternative comedy. And this was a show about the brutality of the American education system. I am a product of the public education system in the US. My husband's the one in the awesome mustache there in the green jacket. And in the show, the main characters were the audience. So we gave them little backpacks and little tiny chairs. And this 360 performance space was constantly reorienting them to try to show the way that often these kinds of educational spaces encourage sort of submission and conformity over actual learning. We made the audience take tests in the middle of the show about content that they couldn't prepare for, sort of with the aim ultimately to try to create a rebellion against the very show itself. Nobody ever won, but a couple audiences got real close. I'm also really interested in site-based theater. The Ballad of Joe Hill was a piece that I did inside a space called Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. And the show was an exploration of a famed labor hero who, Joe Hill was a Swedish immigrant who was active sort of in the 19-teens in the western part of the US. He was part of this very radical labor union called the Industrial Workers of the World, and was accused and eventually convicted of a murder that he almost certainly didn't commit. And it was theorized that this was probably because the government was trying to get rid of him undertaking these organizing activities. The show was narrated by a very creepy woman that you see in the center there, who's actually based on historical documents that were uncovered about 100 years after Hill was killed. And she was in the trial, Hill claimed that he was with a woman the night of the murder, but didn't want to reveal her identity because of the sort of gender politics of the time. A lot of people assumed that that was a lie, and there was a historian who uncovered that this woman actually was a real person, that she wrote about Hill. And so the piece sort of takes her perspective, sort of imagining the transition of this person from a real life relationship into this symbol that he eventually became for the labor movement. The space is this incredible historic prison. It's about 20 feet wide by a football field long. So it was a really interesting design challenge to think about how to use the architecture of a place that both holds the memories of actual people who were imprisoned and died there, but also to use it as a kind of metaphor for the way that history is sometimes impermeable to us. And we use these series of sort of curtains that we would light in different kind of ways to sort of show her relationship to both Hill's legacy, but also the way that time obscures the real facts. It was also a really incredible acoustic space. The main way that Hill created his, transmitted his messages is he would rewrite, because a lot of the people he was working with were illiterate, so he would rewrite the lyrics to traditional Christian hymns with labor propaganda messages so that people could remember them even if they couldn't read. Again, kind of switching gears, is anybody familiar with H.P. Lovecraft? Yeah, so this is a piece that I call a cryptozoology horror comedy. It's sort of a mashup of like Jacques Cousteau plus H.P. Lovecraft. And it toured to actual science lecture halls around the Philadelphia region. So we would like go into the lecture hall and sort of retrofit it with a bunch of theatrical equipment, and then invite audiences into what looked like a marine biology lecture. In it, the group of folks who had undertaken the mission would sort of teach a bunch of stuff about the giant squid and then share the fact that they were like trying to raise money for these research funds. The whole thing was like obviously very silly and stupid. So it was like a lot of funny, really jokey stuff, until you start to learn that actually the ancient Nordic tome that had given the clue to the spawning ground of where the squid was existing may have been translated incorrectly. And slowly the space starts to uncover using the theatrical equipment that we'd like embedded into it. This kind of deeper mystery about perhaps the squid is something beyond just a squid, until eventually like everybody becomes possessed and the demon creature takes over the whole audience. This is a piece that I'll come back to at the end. This was a prototype performance that is actually currently an inspiration for a new project. In its original iteration, it was one of my first big community collaborative projects. I partnered with Drexel University, which has a game studio program. And we were really interested in exploring gentrification through the metaphor of alien invasion. And we hooked up with a community center and created a performance that was part interactive audience engagement and part mobile app. So audiences would show up at the start of the show, and the main character would immediately begin to go like, okay, great, you're here for Invasion Day, let's get going. And everybody would be like, what are you talking about? And what was revealed is that this mysterious disease, the forgetting, which was our metaphor for gentrification, had impacted everyone in the audience, meaning that they had forgotten the fact that they'd been part of this years-long resistance alliance trying to fight the forgetting in this space. So we would take the audience through like a lecture to remember all the salient parts about the disease, have them play games together to try to remember facts about each other and the information about the local neighborhood that they're in. And then we would send them out with a uniquely designed mobile app to gather oral histories from real residents who are in danger of being displaced in the neighborhood to bring it back as material for the anti-forgetting force. The last piece I'll talk about before I do a little deep dive onto Trail Off is probably the most gamey project I worked on. This is a piece called The End, and it was a 30-day experience played partly with analog objects like this card deck and partly over text message. And the aim of this project is based on research that says, maybe paradoxically for some, that if we spend consistent, regular time thinking about our own mortality, we're statistically happier in life. I was really interested by that fact. And as somebody who had an extreme fear of death when I took this project on, I was really interested to see, one, if that was true, and two, how you could create some kind of game that would encourage people to do this thing that might otherwise be really tricky to bring into your daily life. So in the game, we had a really extensive intake process that I can talk about if people are interested in, partly because we didn't want people playing the game unless they really understood and had a sense of why they wanted to be there. But once you signed up for the piece, you would get sent the materials that you see here, a journal, some postcards, an original deck of cards. And then you'd get an invitation from this character called The End, who was sort of a cheeky manifestation of mortality, inviting you to play the game via text message on the first day. When you text back, you get to pick a challenge out of the unique deck of cards. We had 3 over the course of the game. This is the first one. And once you select a mission, you head to an online web portal that gives you some background about the mission's challenge, and then a small kind of 20-minute exercise to undertake at some point over the course of your day. Card challenges range from everything, like the one up in the upper right invites you to make a menu for the last meal you ever want to eat. The one on the left invites you to catalog the important objects in your life and think about who you might want to pass them along to. This one down on the right invites you to write a letter to the future for after you're gone. And then you could go, as an optional bonus, to a park, find a geocache box, leave yours, and take one for somebody else. After each challenge, players would text message with the end. And these conversations were pretty open-ended. Our goal here was really just to help the player uncover the meaning that they were making out of their own life experience. So in the same way that we as theater makers, sometimes when we're creating a new piece, we'll sort of take the massive data of our life and try to make a story out of it. We were trying to do that collaboratively with them. Some folks, didn't need a lot of help from the end. They'd text back in and go, great, I got it. Peace out, that's fine. We had some folks who really, really enjoyed unpacking with us. And our rule was that we would talk to them as long as they stayed engaged with the game. So in some cases for hours. We kept these really expansive dossiers on every player because we had about 8 actors performing the character over the course of the whole thing. And we could never be sure that the same actor would be talking to the same player. So we have these kind of really beautiful documents of, Martin's grandmother died when he was 10, and that was a really impactful experience. And so if another player heard a mention of that, they could go back in and see the whole journey from start to finish. At the end of the game, we invited all the players to a party inside a historic cemetery. So they all had been playing separately and then got to meet each other for a big kind of funeral wake all together, where we also unmasked the folks who were behind the game so they got a chance to chat. And we definitely had some players who really got into this kind of like party funeral thing. After the game was over, again, I mentioned I was a chemistry major. And because the game was all mostly played via text message, we had these huge logs. I mean, like tens of thousands of text messages. And with player consent, I was really interested to see if we could mine that for data. So I actually worked with a data scientist from the University of Pennsylvania to do this huge visualization project where we actually hand-coded every single text message that a player sent based on a number of different categories for things that we were looking for in the game, things like displaying vulnerability and bravery, or being willing to undergo agency and transformational change. And there's like a 72-page report. You can find it on Swim Pony's website. But it was pretty astonishing to see, like, we had different patterns based on gender, based on order that people played things in. We had certain cards that, for whatever reason, would hit particular categories, or that, like, there's one card, which definitely will not go into the next round of the game, that universally makes people too sad. Like, it's just, if you play this card, every single person got depressed. So it was a really interesting kind of iterative experiment to figure out which things were effective and which weren't. I might pause here for a second just to see if there are any questions. I'll do like a longer Q&A at the end, but if there's like a short question that anybody has about anything before I go on.
Oh, I was so glad you paused then, because I really wanted to ask you what the card was that university made everyone sad.
So actually, it was this one that I mentioned, which I totally don't understand, but it's this one that you write a letter with a message to the future to leave after you're gone. We cannot figure out what it is about this card that bummed people out so much. But it was like near universal that people had that response.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering, how can we take part in the second part of the game?
Say again one more time.
I was wondering how we can take part in the second version of the game.
Yeah, I mean, the intake was really extensive. We had a social worker who was a core member of the team, and there were a bunch of different parts of it. So there was a psychological screen that included some standard mental health questions. Having depression, anxiety, or even previous experiences of suicidal ideation was not a barrier to playing. But if that was something that you self-reported, our clinical social worker would just call the person and say, like, hey, here's the deal, here's what the game is about. Do you feel like this is something that you're in a good place to play right now? We did have a couple people who kind of opted out after talking about it more extensively. Everybody who did opt in and had that background showed the same, oh, I forgot to mention. So one of the outcomes of this, actually, we worked with a positive psychologist. This is pretty cool. I can't believe I forgot this. Statistically, if you play the end, you are happier, less anxious, more willing to reach out to family and friends in times of crisis. So actually, like the psychological study that the whole game was based on does bear out in this. But what I was going to say is, for folks who came in with some of those mental health markers, they received the same positive health benefits regardless, which was really exciting to see. The other thing that we did is we would just talk through some of the activities that the game has. There's a challenge. This was one of the more intensive kind of role play challenges. We actually have a practice experience of receiving an end of life diagnosis, because it's one of those things you don't get a lot of experience doing. And so it's a simulation based on my background in medical history previous to going into theater, where players would actually get to come in, practice that experience, and then get to debrief about it. And so we would run through stuff like that in the intake, just saying, any of these that are going to be triggers for you, let us know. The last thing we did was we actually made players write a little essay, because we had some folks who were just like, oh, this is a cool immersive game thing. And not to say that that's not a cool reason to play something, but we really didn't want anybody to be playing this game unless they really wanted and resonated with the mission of spending a month thinking about mortality as a kind of reflective practice. So if it was just because you thought the interface was cool, those players were usually shunted out of the final selection. So that was sort of the intake from start to finish. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you know, sorry, if anyone after playing it kind of drastically changed their lifestyle?
I do. This is the craziest thing. So people, we stayed in touch with players. We actually did a 6-month follow-up survey, and we were able to show that the mental health benefits were still in place 6 months after the game. But I anecdotally got messages from people all the time. One player told me that they proposed to their partner. Another player said that they moved across the country, which they had been thinking about but had been putting off for years. And those are just the couple that people specifically made a note of. So yeah, there were some really exciting, that was sort of the hope, right? Is to go you only have so much time, right? Yeah. One last one.
Hi, so it's a bit of a bleak question.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'm intrigued as to whether you sort of toured it or engaged people from different localities or different communities where there might be a different relationship with shorter life or tragic deaths or like the variation of audiences and their lives and how that might impact.
It's something I have been dying, to remount this piece. We've gotten, I was in partnership with a historic cemetery that was really interested in remounting the work. And we had actually a couple of different contexts. There was a medical school that was interested in making it part of their curriculum. And then COVID hit and people's relationship to death really changed. I personally think, we were pretty careful to say this is not a game for people in active dying processes. We did have one player who was in the midst of cancer diagnosis, and we talked a lot with her to make sure that she was ready for what it brought up. It's a sample case of one, but anecdotally, she said that it was one of the most helpful things while she was going through that process. So I have an impulse that it's probably something that could be an affirmative, very life-giving thing, but we just haven't had the chance to redo it. The other thing that's really hard about grant funding for this project is you get one panelist who's freaked out about death, and they just tank it. And I've actually gotten feedback, there's a grant in the US that I've applied, and we almost always get it, and there's one panelist, I don't know who they are, because it's anonymous, but we get this feedback that's I saw this project before, it freaked me out, I will never pass this forward. And it's tricky because it's actually why the game was created, right? Is we have this very discomforting response to thinking about death. But I can't, like that person has to play the game before we get to the other side of it. Yeah. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to speed a little bit through this just so that I stay on top of time. But this is a project that I'm working on right now. It is a mobile app that embeds BIPOC and queer authored immersive audio stories onto nature trails. It's a collaboration with the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, which is a state environmental advocacy organization in the States, and also Echoes, which is a UK software platform, which is how I got introduced to Martin, actually. My collaborator, Josh, who's down in Devon. Like I said, it is this collaboration between my company and PEC to create it. We actually got the money through a Watershed education initiative with the idea that environmentalism in the US, but I think everywhere, generally has what I call a very beige problem. So my proposal for the piece originally kind of comes from this question, which in the US, these are the kinds of images you tend to see in environmental websites. And maybe you can notice the same pattern that I do, which is that it's very, very white. And so the thesis behind this project is that if you don't see yourself represented in the stories we tell about environmentalism, you're going to be a lot less motivated to show up, participate, or feel active in the movement to protect the environment. So the thesis of this project was saying, well, if you want people to feel like being a part of nature is a story that they're telling about themselves, it might be helpful to create stories that actually reflect them in the landscape. So I worked with 10 different authors who each wrote a story for a different trail in the Philadelphia region that in some way represents their perspective as someone self-identified as underrepresented in traditional environmental programming. And the idea is to create a live performance, kind of a site-based piece for one person that's accessible at any time you want to go. So if you have the app, you can just pick a story, you can read a little bit about it on there, and then when you show up, the geolocative stuff that's already in your phone unlocks the story at particular spots in the landscape that correspond to what the writer has written. There is an interface so you can check to make sure you're on the right route, but my goal for this was really to feel like you were not in your phone, that you were connecting deeper into the landscape. I'll show just a tiny bit of this is a video of a person walking a trail, just so you sort of get a sense of what it looks like in practice.
Rumi said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Doctors say, a wound is just the body healing itself. Do you see how each river swallows the sun, feeding everything it touches? Do you see how that makes each body of water also a wound? Does the earth not heal itself with water? And what happens if it all dries? If a scar is a wound left unhealed, is it not also the absence of light? Have you ever wondered why water scars everything it touches? This land, so bright, so wounded, so dim, so scarred. And you, how close are you to becoming the sun? What scars do you leave behind? What wounds you?
The big drone shot up ahead. This is a really interesting trail because it straddles one of the highest income disparities between zip codes in the US. So you could sort of see the really hyper-developed highway on the one side. And then on the other side is Pennsauken, which is this incredibly wealthy neighborhood. And a FOC who wrote this piece was really interested in the way that the river divides these two spaces geographically. So popping back over here. Oops. So I can talk a little bit more about the process in the Q&A, but I think there were two kind of main things to know about the creation of this project. The one was kind of a technological storytelling question, which is this is sort of a new form. It's not quite podcast, it's not quite site-specific theater, it's self-directed, it's audio. So I was really interested in what kinds of stories work really well in this format. And then the other piece was to think about how do we really embed community engagement at the core of the work that we're doing. So I brought a bunch of artists. We would just go out to trails and just try to notice what was interesting narratively. Like when you think about walking as a solo person, what evokes story, what evokes a sense of space, what evokes a sense of character when all you have is the static landscape. We also did a lot of work thinking about the opportunity of binaural audio and what does it mean to play with the spatialization. What does it mean also to be wearing headphones and disconnected from the authentic sounds in the landscape? And how do you recreate that for people? And then we spent a lot of time working with the app developer to think about what kinds of functions would be needed in the app to be able to do the thing that the authors wanted to do. We coalesced all of that in this big research packet, which I would give to authors at the beginning of the project, along with some example pieces for them to check out to try to take inspiration. Concurrently, I was working with the Environmental Council to pick a bunch of different trails that felt like they had really evocative opportunities for storytelling. We ended up with a mix of urban, suburban, and rural trails because we really wanted a range of all the different kind of trail networks that were in the region. And then we did this kind of crazy matching process with the 10 authors. You saw a picture of a FOC before, who represent a real range of both kind of lived experience perspectives, but also genres of writing. So we had everything from science fiction to horror. We had like really beautiful lyric poets, playwrights. So it's a huge range of styles that people wrote in. We had a bunch of workshops where we sort of downloaded all that information with the authors, gave them a chance to ask questions. And throughout the whole process of them being in residence on their trail, we met regularly, sort of depended on on each person's particular process. Some folks were really interested in the local history, so we'd find a way to facilitate them with historians in the area. We had one writer who was really excited about the indigenous history of the area, and we're able to hook them up with tribal leaders that I'd worked with on a previous project to like get information from the indigenous perspective. Everybody walked away from that 5-month residency period both with a script and then this series of sort of story points where they wanted things to trigger with some information about like how they wanted that to happen. And that's what I would take away and then sort of put into, you know, kind of a digital mapping thing. And then basically, I call this like directing by spreadsheet, taking their script, thinking about how it would lay on top of the physical landscape, and then trying to come up with a set of functions that would be able to play no matter what the user did to try to break them. And then also to think about the kinds of soundscape and music that we would need underneath it to carry that sense of continuous narrative cohesion from start to finish. My amazing collaborator, Michael Kiley, who's on the right of the actor there with the headphones, composed essentially 10 full-length, like hour-and-a-half audio pieces across all the different range of styles. We had over 100 artists, musicians, and actors that were part of all the different pieces. And the final version of it was to hook up with Echoes, which if you don't know this software platform and you're interested in geolocative audio, I highly recommend it. I teach this now in my immersive game design and performance class. It's really simple to use, it's super approachable, and it's free. So you know, you can just plug in your different audio pieces once we've gone through all the recording, mixing, and mastering. And then there are just really simple functions, you know, to play things like to decide whether you want it to be spatialized, whether you want it to be able to resume if somebody leaves the zone that it's looped in. I can talk a lot about this if people are interested in the details, but you can set things up to queue and order and all this kind of stuff. So the app is available. You can get it on iOS or Android. Unfortunately, there are no stories for the UK yet. We're working on that right now. But you can go on and kind of like putz around with some of the different features. We thought a lot about, giving people information about accessibility and content tags and information about the author. You can also get previews of the routes and public transportation, or even kind of interesting information about the surrounding area. I want to get to the Q&A, but I'll just suffice to say we've done a ton of community outreach. So everything from workshops with writers to going to like themed community events that have connection to the content or the location. We would do things where we would invite a bunch of people to the trail and physically like help them with the app and walk on site with them. We've also been doing tracking of all of the different IP addresses and cross-referencing that with IP and census data to get a sense of who's using the app. And we're in the midst of this huge outreach, grant-funded outreach project right now to try to like physically get, like we just go to like businesses, community centers, libraries. We just sort of show up because we found that once you've done it once, you think it's really cool. And getting people over that initial hump with the new technology is really the biggest barrier to access. The last thing I will say, just maybe as a little exciting thing, Monday, I'm meeting with Deanna Roger, who's a Bristol-based amazing poet. Oh, that's right, I forgot. Yeah. Is that how, I can't remember if that's how I met her. Yeah. So we're going to take a walk on Monday in the hopes that she will be our first UK-based writer for the Trail Off app. So super duper excited. She's such an amazing writer and really excited to think about the potential for expanding the app here. I think with that, if you want to learn more about it, you can look up trailoffquicklook.com, or you can just search for Trail Off in your app store of choice. I think that's about it. If you want to like check out Swim Pony, that's our information. But with that, I guess I'll just open it up for any questions people have.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. I think the microphone is down there at the back somewhere, but any questions? Tony's got one.
Thank you very much. Zoyanda says, firstly, thank you so much for the software recommendation. And then they also said they've been having weird and uncomfortable feelings lately about audience development and marketing. So your approach to selecting an audience is fascinating to them. I wonder if you have any thoughts or advice on what might be called small management. What approaches are you taking forwards in future work?
I mean,
community management.
Yeah. I think I have never been somebody who's trying to make things at super large scale. And so for me, every project begins from thinking about who the audiences are. I think a lot of theater companies sort of presume that the audience they have for one show is going to follow them for every project that they do afterwards. I think there are people who see Swim Pony's work across a variety of projects, but I'm much more interested in going, what's the content of the piece? And how are we going to find the people that are attracted to that content and do it in a way that's going to be the most exciting, playful, resonant, meaningful. With The End, for example, I kind of became the omnipresent death lady in Philadelphia. There are these meetup group called Death Cafes. I don't know if they have them here. Yeah. And so I would just show up at death cafes and just kind of listen, hear people talk about stuff. I would mention the game. I went to a bunch of different, there's a woman who's a thanatologist, which is what they call folks who are experts in end-of-life care and death and dying. And I spoke at a couple classes that she taught. I would go give lectures at this historic cemetery that I mentioned. So it was really trying to find people that had curiosity or interest in end of life. There's this organization called Death Over Dinner, which is really big in the US, and we hosted a bunch of those dinners. And so a lot of it was about trying to find people that actually already had a need for something like the game, and then sending that information out after the fact. For something like Trail Off, it's been, even though the app has the potential to be played all over the place because there are 10 different stories, we found a lot more success by really focusing in on both the content of the story, the communities that are connected to that content, and then the geographic proximity to the trail. A lot of people don't even know that these sites exist near where they live. And so some of it is just to go, I want them to listen to the story, but if they go, oh my God, there's a trail there, and they don't even know about the app, to me, that's still a win. A lot, so we have these 2 outreach coordinators who will just go to public libraries or community centers and just hang out during, reading hours or things like that and go, if you're interested in this kind of content, or if you want to be getting out and doing active things, like here's a thing, do you want to sign up for the email? Do you want me to show you how to put it on your phone right now and teach you all the features? So it's a very, very hands-on approach. Hopefully that answers the question. Yeah.
Violet also wanted to say how fantastic the talk was.
Oh, thanks.
Any other questions? Yep.
Thanks. In your early work, I was intrigued that you had a lovely sense of playfulness running through it, but also horror. Could you talk a bit about how the two connect for you?
Gosh. I wouldn't have put that together, but it's true. I mean, I'm a big fan of horror movies. I really love them. I love being scared. Gosh, there's an amazing horror story in Trail Off. If you're ever in Philadelphia, Carmen Maria Machado's story, she's an amazing Gothic queer horror writer. She's blowing up. We're really lucky we got her when we did because we could never have afforded her afterwards. But there's this local kind of mythological creature called the Jersey Devil that is unique to the New Jersey, Philadelphia region. And over the course of the story, it's so terrifying when you're out in the woods and this monster starts following you as you're walking down the trail. And the end, anyway, go do the story. It's really good. I think part of it is with the giant squid, for example, I find humor and horror are this interesting dual-sided coin. When we're laughing, we're out of control in some way, right? It is this experience that overtakes us. And I think when we're scared, that's true as well. And so those early pieces kind of playing with funny, really scary, I think is maybe part to do with that kind of quality. And then some of it is just, I just really love, it's also you never see scary plays. Hard in a theater. I think in a way, because we're so acclimated to the fourth wall, I think it's tricky to do ethical horror in the theater because you're either actually traumatizing your audience or they have such a sense of safety that they can't quite buy in. So I find it kind of an interesting challenge to go, can you scare somebody without actually doing something awful to them? I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Actually, before I ask my question, I had something further to that point. There was an amazing interview with the director Jordan Peele that came out recently, where he says that in film, at least, the difference between horror and comedy is the music and the framing.
Yeah.
I think they are. I think they are quite closely linked. But I was just going to ask if you could say a little bit about what your personal impetus was for thinking more about death and encouraging a dialogue in your creative practice.
Yeah, I mean, this almost sounds sort of too simple to say, but I've always been really afraid of death. And, I was one of those little kids who would start thinking about infinity and get freaked out. And I think it was just, it was one of those things that I would have moments in life where I would just suddenly really consciously become aware, oh my God, I'm going to die. And that feeling would would kind of overtake me in this panic mode. And I noticed myself really trying to push it away. And then I read this book called Staring at the Sun, which is by a positive psychologist named Irving Yalom. And it's actually about using consciousness of death as a therapeutic tool to make change in life. And I remember reading that book, and there were exercises that he would have people do to visualize the end of their own lives. And I thought, that sounds horrible. And yet, the book kept talking about these incredible positive benefits. And so while I was in grad school, I started playing with this idea of, well, maybe a game is a context where there's enough structure and kind of repetition and low barrier to entry to curate how to do something like that. And it is interesting. I mean, it's not to say that I'm like, oh yes, like I have no fear of death at all. But I used to feel really uncomfortable talking about it. My husband also worked on the game, and you know, it's hard for me to remember actually a time when it wasn't something that I felt really comfortable with. And it was something that I think the players pretty consistently talked about, feeling so much more prepared to negotiate these kind of situations, because I think we often don't talk about them until we're in the most intense, heightened moments of our lives. And there's also a lot of research that says if you can have one good conversation about death with family members before you're in crisis mode, like it just eases, because you just have a basis to start. My mom, who's a clinical psychologist, played the beta version of the game. I don't recommend that. Well, maybe I do. I mean, it's interesting. She said stuff to the character she never told me. And I would say, you know, Mom, I'm not the only person on the other side of this game. And she'd be like, yeah, I know. And then she'd be like, the end, tell my daughter this. Like, and I think there's something about, because it's over text message, because there's a little bit of like a mask, a playful mask, I think it lowers the barrier. You know, that thing that also allows people to be nasty trolls in YouTube comments also lowers the barrier to talking about really difficult things. And so there's something about the anonymity and the little bit of remove because of the text message part of it that I actually think it just, I mean, the stuff it was, you know, we didn't know when we first started developing it if people would get into it. I mean, and often the performers would be moved to tears by stuff that people shared. I mean, it was so intimate. It was such an intense relationship. I remember at the party, my husband met this woman who he'd been following pretty much every day of her journey. And she said her name, and he just burst out crying because he was just so moved with how brave she had been in tackling some of the stuff that she dealt with. Anyway, that's a long answer to a shorter question.
No, it's great, thanks.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Great.
Just when you're talking about death, were a lot of the conversations that came up through the process about death, was it mainly focused on the actual kind of physicality of dying, or just the concept of not existing?
It was a mix. If we end up getting to do the game again, what we did was we actually created kind of a periodic table of elements of the different challenges. So some of them were very practical, just thinking about, you know, end-of-life healthcare proxy, that kind of, you know, funeral plans, that kind of stuff. Other things were really looking at the physical, like, body aspect and catalog. There's a card that sort of has you go through like major experiences of pain and sort of thinking about what your tolerance might be for negotiating physical pain at the end of life. Some of them were very philosophical. So there's one where you take a walk and just notice things that remind you of death in the landscape. So it was intentionally quite broad, and that was partly to give people a chance to get into the material in whatever way they were comfortable with without requiring them to deal with it in the way that we prescribed. There were 52 cards in the game, and you could only play about half of them. So there was a lot more content than an individual player could deal with. And I think we wanted to have a kind of variety of different content matter, and then also, some of them were writing prompts, some of them were, calling a friend and having a conversation. Some of them were going out into the landscape. So lots of different ways to engage and lots of different aspects to hit up.
Tony.
Oh, this is a question from Violet. They say, so Violet is an early careers designer interested in creating large immersive productions like your earliest work, Survive. They're grappling with the enormous process of materialising funding and pulling off a project like that. Could they ask for reasons why you moved away from app game-based content? And additionally, would you ever make a piece of large-scale immersive projects like Survive again?
Yeah, I mean, true, very true. Survive was made with $10,000. And we got access to an empty warehouse that the person who owned it was turning into a nightclub. So they said, you can do whatever you want. You can cut through walls. You can do whatever you feel like. So that was a lucky find. I think also, as I've gotten more into the environmental sustainability, that's a piece of it. Theater can be a very wasteful medium. And so trying to think about how the world is an immersive environment. And so if you construct something, there really has to be a reason that you want to construct it as opposed to finding something that already exists to invite people into. That said, I'm actually working on a project. It's in early development right now, but it'll be the first return that Swim Pony does to a full theatrical immersive experience. It's a piece called The Stupidest, Scariest Time, and it's an exploration of why we're all so obsessed with working all the time. This is very American productivity culture, and so it's a productivity boot camp that then turns into over the course of the thing, we run people through all these kind of like life hacking exercises. Like you get all these worksheets to get to your goals, and it's sort of a piece about like, the more productive we quote unquote are, the more we're actually spending time just answering overstuffed email inboxes and like these teeny tiny to-do lists versus spending the time where we say that we want to. So it will be like a game-based immersive theater show. So I think the thing that I would say to somebody who's like starting this kind of work is that you can prototype stuff before you have all the money. And so I think like waiting for $500,000 before you begin to create the scripts or imagine something is one of the mistakes that I made early on. Is I just kept waiting to have all of the money and stuff, and then you never kind of get going. And I think you can have really expansive, ambitious design hopes, but be making progress on it, which is going to get you into the place where the funding, I think, I don't want to say comes easy, but it comes easier.
Anybody else?
Hi. I'd really love to play the game. I hope that you do it again and do it here. But I wanted to ask you a question about Trail Off. It was exciting to see ambient literature listed as one of the influences in your list. That was a project that came out of the studio here, so that was really nice. And obviously, as you know, lots of the thinking in that project was about like writing for this kind of form. And so I was interested in the process that you go through with writers who, I imagine have different degrees of experience with writing for like audio and writing for location-specific type work and kind of what that looks like as a process.
Yeah. I mean, the advantage we have now is we have stories they can do, so they can go and try them. And I think that, in some ways, is the easiest thing, is you really feel the difference between somebody who's talking at you and somebody who's inviting you to be present. I think a lot about how to invite people into character in these kinds of spaces, because it's, I say, like, if you're in the space, you are having an embodied experience, whether the writer is acknowledging it or not. And so I'm feeling wind on my face. I'm feeling my feet on the ground. Like, I'm smelling whatever's in the air. And I think inviting people into that kinesthetic, experiential, sensory part of the interface with the real world is pretty key to grounding them in a sense of place. Unlike, especially with novel writers, I think, who are really used to people meeting them on the page, kind of reversing that process and going, you are finding the person in the present moment that they're in. And so in a way, you have to think about writing that meets them at that moment sometime in the future. And you can shift them into these like memories or places or activities that are happening, but that's the place where the story starts. So there's a lot of grounding that we do at the beginning, also kind of demonstrating. Sometimes the tech is so good that it's almost too virtuosic. People think it's a podcast, and they go like, oh wow, it's just like synced up. I just happen to be walking at the right pace. No, like there's a lot, there's a lot that it takes to get that to happen. And so sometimes I would hire actors to read the scripts that writers wrote, and we would just walk together in time and space. One, so that they would get an experience, like kind of like ish experience of the app. And also to see like, it's a very time-based medium, which again, for people who are writing only on the page, if you write too much content and it goes over the landscape, you can't tell somebody to stop walking. I mean, you can, but it's really lame. And we had writers who tried, who ultimately it was their projects. We had a couple people who would go, stop and stand here. And I was like, you don't want to do that. And they really wanted to do it. And inevitably, people just get itchy, right? It's a trail, and it's meant to be traversed. And so if you ask somebody to stop, you better have a really good reason for doing it. Those are just a couple of the kinds of things that we found.
That's really interesting, thanks.
All right, I think we got time for one last online question.
Very quick one, a reflection. Lucy says, this is so inspiring, thank you so much. They reflect that my husband is Pakistani and has a completely different take on death, which has improved my English family's outlook. Then they ask, have you ever read Being Mortal by Atul Gawande?
Yeah, we have on Swim Pony's website, if you go into the end tab, we actually created a syllabus of every single source that we used in the research for the game, which was, I don't know, it's like a couple hundred different things that are either quoted in the game or that we used as background reading. That was a huge inspirational book. And if anybody wants like a lot of content about death, you can go download the syllabus for the end and read a lot more about it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Adrienne.
Yeah.
All right, before you all go, if you do want to stick around in Hot Desk today, find out more about what we do, please come find one of the studio team. Give us a wave, studio team. There's loads of us here today. We'll be happy to help. If you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions. And one last reminder, this is the last talk for this year. Don't turn up next week. We'll be back on January 12th with some more talks. We've got AI-powered guitars, we've got creative technology in the civil service, and we've got an audio play about the 1831 Reform riots. So please don't miss any of that. Thank you all for being here today, and we'll see you all again next year.